Hey, Mike here, and it's another no bullshit Saturday. So today let's ask ourselves the fundamental question. Will AI take our jobs? So some time ago I said that UX is changing significantly and it's actually gonna die in the form that we know it right now. And that shift is mainly coming from the fact that first of all we know quite a lot already and we can use that knowledge, and there are a lot of processes that are not that essential and they are time consuming, so of course the customers don't really want to spend the money on them if they don't have to. But let's start from the beginning. Well, the AI revolution is well underway and there are already pretty good guidelines to how to handle AI so it doesn't kill us like Skynet. And it's happening right now that AI and machine learning and robots are taking more and more jobs slowly. Some of those technologies are not completely ready yet, like self-driving cars, but they are very close. So it's gonna be a huge shift when AI replaces a lot of those boring jobs. So jobs like working the cash register when you just do beep, beep, beep. Well, this could well be done by a machine, and I think that a lot of people working in these jobs, they kind of know that they're doing something with not a lot of value, so they might go and do some other things, and if not, then we'll probably have to discuss universal basic income at some point, which has its downsides and upsides. So obviously AI can take all the boring jobs like well, cash registers and driving and Ubers and all that. Uber is already working on AI-driven cars. But what about the more important jobs? Because we all kind of pat ourselves on the back saying that, oh yeah, UX is just one of the most important jobs out there and it's just so necessary and we are so awesome and good UXers are the soul of the earth and they're just basically the most important job there is. But then let's look at another important job, doctors. And while AI or robots won't really replace doctors, they are already well underway to replace doctors in analyzing x-rays for many different diseases, because their accuracy and the fact that they were fed a huge amount of already analyzed data, well, it's way better than humans. And also there are robot arms performing some parts of the operations, and there will be nanorobots that you inject into your bloodstream and they're gonna fix you up from the inside. So some of that is already happening, but I think that especially in medicine, it's not gonna be like a takeover of robots over human doctors, because that human touch, that human connection is also very necessary in a process of getting well, but AI and robots will supplement their work in a very big way. So what about user experience? So I wanted to divide it into the main two parts of user experience. So obviously one is research and the other is design. And those two parts have various different elements in them, or various different techniques that people are using. And some of those techniques can and probably will be replaced at some point by robots or artificial intelligence. But just as with doctors, I think that a huge part of user research is actually having that personal connection, you know, empathy and, well, being in the same room. Well, maybe not right now, but, you know, in general. Robots and AI won't really replace any part of the research that requires that human connection to work. So they won't facilitate workshops, they won't conduct interviews, and they won't do one-on-one studies and things like that. That's still reserved for humans, and I think it's gonna stay that way. But, of course, there are parts of the UX process that can be replaced. And one of those parts is definitely quantitative analysis, because, well, analyzing large chunks of data is something that the machines are already better at than us. And of course, it requires teaching them how to do that, but it's gonna save a huge amount of time to focus on different areas of the user experience process, and that part can be handed over to the machines almost completely. And I think that's good. Okay, but what about qualitative research? Well, that's a little bit harder because obviously we need to have that human empathy and the human understanding of another person. But at the same time, there are already algorithms in all the social media that are analyzing what we're doing, saying, and posting. And they are able to process all that information in a very precise way, and targeted advertising and all that happens because of that. So I think that it's definitely harder for qualitative to be done by robots, but it's completely possible, and some parts of it are gonna be moving to AI as well. It's gonna take a lot more human feedback and human teaching the machines, but at some point it will happen for some parts of that process. But looking at it in a little bit closer detail, for example, card sorting. Well, if we go with not like physical cards, but more like a tablet-based interface, and we have some previous studies and we have some previous examples of similar systems, I think that AI can actually generate the cards and also process the information at the end after the users have sorted them. So it would be looking for patterns, and it would be looking for the most common ways people have put those cards together. And I think that part can be automated pretty quickly. So click testing is also another thing that could be done by AI. It's already partially being done by AI, like some of the tools out there are making heat maps on their own from the clicks in recorded videos. So I think that this part is also gonna be automated, because it's actually kind of boring. Like, we've analyzed hundreds of videos, recordings of people interacting with digital interfaces, and at some point you realize that there is a lot of the same mistakes. Like, out of the 100 videos, if you could find that 5 or 10 videos that show the biggest problem and that you can focus on a solution, that would be very helpful. So AI can actually do that for you. It can look at the videos, analyze them, look for patterns as well, and provide you with like much more condensed and streamlined information for it. So you won't have to waste the time by looking at the videos yourself. And it's a very time-intensive process, so why bother? So what about usability testing? Well, if we have a desired outcome and we can analyze what the user is doing, we can pretty much do usability testing as well, because the AI would simply compare what the user is doing with the desired outcome, and there could be also the opposite, like a non-desired outcomes, and we'll see in what cases the user is doing what, and then have like a full report at the very end outlining the main problems in the interface. So what about heuristics? That's one of my favorite words. And if you don't know what heuristics means, it's basically our all collective knowledge, so all the good practices and all the things that we already know about how to make good UI and good user experiences. And that's a little bit harder because it comes from experience, and sometimes it's very hard to define what is that good practice. But at the same time, I think that if we teach the AI a little bit, it's gonna be pretty good at it. Maybe not as good as humans, but we can definitely supplement them in that kind of evaluation. Okay, so what about personas? Well, that's basically just data collection and creating those data points. And I think that especially now when the computer can actually just grab the photos of people, from some online source and generate their names and their backstories, and based on other research provided beforehand, it can create their pain points and everything else. I think that personas are going away, because basically most of that can be done by computers now. Okay, so what about design? Well, starting from the very beginning, we have the flow diagrams, and I think that they can somehow come from the card sorting exercises. So like choosing the best possible outcome of what the users have tested for in the card sorting exercise. So AI probably could create some basic flows, but I still believe that humans are needed for it, because it's not as easy to come up with a working and fully functional flow that's sometimes not very mathematical. Sometimes some of the branches go in a direction that requires the understanding of how it works, and it's not really that logical. So it might be difficult, but at the same time, AI can pre-fill some of the easier flows for us, like the registration process, the onboarding process, the logins, the forgot your password and all that. even possibly the checkout, because it's very similar and based on the good practices. If we feed the AI with those good practices, it can maybe even generate the good checkout flow. And of course, some form of human control over this is completely necessary. But if you just press a button and you end up with a very good flow based on research from various different sources in just one place in a few seconds, you're gonna be in a much better position to modify it and enhance it, but it's gonna take away all of those extra hours spent on thinking about the flows. So that's very good. So with low fidelity wireframes, I think it's one step harder than the flow diagrams, but if we have the flow diagrams already done, some of those diagrams and some of those nodes can be expanded into a full wireframe and pre-filled. So just as before with the very simple processes like registration and login, the AI can actually create those wireframes for us because they're very similar most of the time. And then you can adjust it to fit the actual product, and then AI can learn from that and know that for this product the process looks like this from now on. I think that wireframes are gonna be probably one of the first ones to go. Okay, so what about UI design, high fidelity design? Well, there are two ways here. Because if you want to build something very specific for a product, something very creative, and you want it to have its own style and its own look and feel and its own kind of emotional connection to the users, it's probably better to let the humans do that. But if you're building like a system that you log into and you have like tables and graphs and charts and things like that, and their flows are pretty similar to other projects like that, and you do have a design system with already pre-made elements and buttons like a primary button, the call to action, secondary, tertiary, and all that, I think that you can actually feed that to the AI, and based on some initial designs, I think that AI could come up with high fidelity designs from that. So based on the flow diagrams and some basic wireframes, it could just pre-fill it with components from a design system. So another thing is prototyping. Yes, I think prototyping will be one of the hardest ones to do, because that same button on two different screens can lead to a completely different action. So understanding that requires a more thorough look at the entire system, and I think that AI is not quite ready for this yet. So yeah, prototyping, so like connecting all the screens together to form a sort of semi-functional flow. This is something that probably should be done by humans for some time yet. And well, the next thing is micro interactions and transitions. And I think that with animation, it's especially difficult because there is this whole feeling element to it. So sometimes just changing the length of some movement by just milliseconds can actually make it feel better and nicer and more friendly to the users. I don't think that machines are capable of feeling like that yet. So they can probably analyze it and they can look for patterns, but even as a designer, you can look at an animation, and if you slow it down by just like 1%, it can look a lot better. And this is just a very subjective, emotional approach to it. And I think that for now we'll be safe to do those ourselves. Well, and the last part is illustration and photography. Well, photography could probably be deepfaked or just recreated from like a bunch of other photos, but it's still better if you have a product to make a specific photo session for the product instead of relying on something similar to stock images. And same with illustration, like there are those illustration libraries where you can kind of, put the head, body, legs and hands and whatever together, and it creates those characters that you can use. And of course AI would be able to use libraries like that to build things, but it's still gonna be using pre-made elements. I still think that for products that have this dedication to quality and they want to be their own thing and they want to have their own unique look and feel, I think it's still better to have a human do it, and it's gonna be done specifically for that project instead of being a collection like a Frankenstein monster of different parts connected together by a machine. That's not gonna have the same impact because at some point everybody's gonna be using those libraries. So if you want to stand out, you need to do something on your own. So in general, I think that AI will take over some of the boring menial tasks in many jobs, and especially in user experience, the things that take a lot of time but really can be automated, I think they will. And it's gonna leave us with a lot more time in the process to come up with much better solutions so we can innovate a lot better. We can come up with things that we didn't really have the time in the process before. We can do much better interactions, or we can even work on the UI a little bit more, because a lot of those initial parts could be done for us in just seconds. And also I think it's gonna solve a little bit of that honesty problem, because when the customer knows that some of those parts can be done by a machine, he's not gonna pay for weeks of work to create some lo-fi wireframes anymore. And that's good, that's gonna benefit the products, and that's gonna benefit the economy as well. And as designers, we need to grow. We can't just stand still and believe that we're gonna be doing the same things over and over. It's gonna be changing, and we need to adapt to stay relevant. So what do you think about AI? Will it take your job, or is your job that essential that it's gonna stay in the human hands forever? I'm actually excited for the future. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time. Cheers!